I was quite surprised to find out that India was actually manufacturing world-class semiconductors back in the 1960s. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I was shocked too. So many people speak about semiconductor manufacturing happening today, but in fact, India had very, in a forward-looking manner, started semiconductor research and production in the 1960s and 1970s. In fact, in the 1980s, we were producing micron-size semiconductor chips, which was leading world standard. Unfortunately, in 1989, there was a massive fire in India's semiconductor laboratory. It blew up all our research that we had done and the advancements we had made. There were a bunch of other Asian countries, most notably Taiwan, which were just picking up then. And I think we went back many decades for which we are still kind of catching up even after 30 years.
And there was a bit of conspiracy around that fire as well. But
Right.
let's walk through the origins of semiconductors and how we kind of got to where we are
Right.
today.
Yeah, I mean, semiconductors are so important. Today, we have it in literally everything. Our conversation that's happening, our homes, everything is run by semiconductors. I don't think anyone would have imagined they would be so ubiquitous. But 100 years ago, they weren't really existing. I think the story starts with vacuum tubes, which were used for computation. Unfortunately, vacuum tubes were huge. To even run a very simple compute, you would need like a room full of vacuum tubes. The evolution from that, where the first kind of semiconductor was created, they're called semiconductors because they conduct and insulate based on certain properties and electricity flowing through them, which is why they are conducting half of the time in semiconductors. The first one was a PN junction. The discovery or the invention was when you added impurities to silicon, which was called doping. And that was actually the first creation of a semiconductor, which was, I think, in the 1920s, 1930s. Many of these semiconductors were put together, and the breakthrough innovation here was in Bell Labs, which has created a bunch of things, including the graphical user interface, which is now used in almost everything. Bell Labs had the transistor being created, which was many semiconductors put together. Um, and one of the people who worked on this transistor was Shockley.
Yeah, no, it, and after that, after those early days and the innovation from Bell Labs, we kind of saw this period of crazy growth, in the 19 from the 1940s to the 1970s. Can you walk us through what happened globally at that time?
Right. So Shockley comes up with his colleagues on the creates a transistor. He does another abstraction, which is putting many transistors together and creating the IC or the integrated circuit. He starts a company called Shockley Semiconductor with a bunch of young engineers who leave almost within a year in late 1950s, 1956, 1957. They start a company called Fairchild Semiconductor, and they were called the Fair Children. This group would actually become one of the most important groups in, I think, human history. Definitely in Silicon Valley history, which is why Silicon Valley is called Silicon Valley today. One of them, unfortunately, he passed away a couple of days back. His name is Gordon Moore. Um, these fair children would eventually start a bunch of very iconic companies. One of them, obviously, is Intel. A fund called Kleiner Perkins was two fair children. One of their juniors, whose name was Don Valentine, started Sequoia. So this group was like super innovative, and I would say Silicon Valley royalty. Intel obviously is the big spin out of Fairchild, and so you have transistors which are put together to make integrated circuits, and then when you put together many integrated circuits, you make the microprocessor. um, Gordon Moore came up with Moore's law, which was that compute uh, on a particular piece of a chip would double every year or so, and that rule has been followed, I think, since he's coined that. So 1940 to 1970 was an explosion in innovation in the semiconductor industry. It obviously set the base for what would happen in the next 50 years.
Yeah, no, and this whole value chain, right? I mean, you spoke about all these companies participating in different parts of it. Can you walk us through what the entire value chain is? Intel, of course, has this full stack approach,
Sure.
but we saw a lot of specialization in different countries, where different countries are focusing on different parts of it.
Right, right, right. So semiconductors was a very nascent industry then, in the 1970s and 80s. Intel obviously had to take a full stack approach because they were the pioneer. What a full stack approach here means is that they design the chip and they manufacture the chip. They own the entire value chain. Um, Somewhere in the mid 1980s, there is this small island near China called Taiwan, um, where a company called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or now as we know TSMC, started a fabrication for Philips, the European giant. Um, TSMC actually was a spin out of this foundry started by Maurice Chang. The idea here was that TSMC would just focus on manufacturing semiconductors and not doing anything else. Now, Intel obviously was the big daddy, and this is like the late 1980s, early 1990s. They were supreme, so it was obvious that whatever they decided and whatever they did seemed like gold standard. But TSMC took a very different path where they said that we'll just focus on manufacturing and Intel can do the whole full stack thing. Um, it seemed like a very bold move then. Today, it seems like it's been the right move because TSMC has become much larger than even Intel.
And with all of this happening globally, India in the early 2000s, late 1990s, started to kind of participate and get into manufacturing. Can you tell us about India's role and how they came into the international market?
So, I think, like we alluded to earlier, India was a country that Fairchild was considering in the 1970s to actually create their plant there, but they eventually ended up going to Malaysia. That said, India still kept making progress till the SCL fire of 1989. After that, India was basically out of the picture. It was Intel which was the supreme king. They were enabled by Microsoft, who put their chips in everything that they sold. I think anybody who has a computer from the 90s would remember the Pentium inside logo, the Intel logo. I think all of us have seen that Intel um, logo of Pentium and Intel inside, right? And obviously, with Windows growth and Intel being their provider for their processing, basically Microsoft and Intel were a supreme duopoly of some sense, but they were monopolies in their individual markets, which is operating systems and microprocessors. Um, Starting a semiconductor company obviously is quite hard because Intel has invested so much over so many years. So there are very high barriers to entry, and there's a lot of capital expenditure that needs to be
Yeah.
done. TSMC continues, it's doing what it is doing, but India is nowhere in the picture now, and I don't think that India really stood a chance. The semiconductor wave after the internet bust of 99 actually continued to grow because the internet bust indicated that the whole world was going to go digital, and the adoption of computers, the adoption of devices beyond just like laptops, you had started to see early signs of phones. Obviously they need chips, we didn't have
Right.
smartphones. You would have devices that use beyond and outside your computers and your phones, right? So the growth of semiconductors, because they power anything that needs compute, continued. I think up to 2007, the growth kept on going, but then the financial crash hit the semiconductor market massively. And the reason for that, like I'd said, is there was so much capital requirement for setting up a semiconductor plant that when money is sucked out of the system, you're not going to put it in investing and innovation. There was a lull period, say from 2008 to 2010, both from a demand and investment standpoint.
And then, slowly after the financial crisis, you see that demand kind of recovering. Demand for electronics grew, and especially in India, we started to see more and more mobile phones
Right,
and demand growing. And I believe we we
right.
started actually doubling down on manufacturing mobile phones. Can you walk us
That's right.
through the
That's
next
right.
few years and how India started to participate?
Sure. Sure. What's fascinating is that India had missed the semiconductor bus, but they realized that we could do something about electronics. So in the 2010 timeframe, we started to double down on electronics manufacturing. You'll be surprised to know that India is the second largest manufacturer of
Yeah,
mobile
yeah.
phones by volume. And I was like shocked to know this,
Second in the
right?
world, like
And
you would not have
we
guessed. It's
manufacture, yeah, yeah, you wouldn't have guessed. And I think this is because of our doubling down on
Mm.
electronics. We've been growing tremendously over the last 10 years. A lot of investment, a lot of policy support has come through. So there are a lot of electronic manufacturing capacity and capability in India that started getting built um, from 2010 onwards. Um, I think by the mid 2010s, India also started to do some chip design work. So many of these large chip manufacturers actually have decent sized teams in India. There's Texas Instruments, there's Intel that have set up small design offices in India. Chip design is basically like how the chip should look, or a map of the chip is a very loose way of describing it. Um, and so India has like now started to become pretty good at electronics. um, and by 2020 we are again in a good shape to possibly take advantage of the situation.
And then, 2020s, there's a lot happening all over the world, some geopolitical changes, but India sees their opportunity again to get back into semiconductors. Can you walk us through what India is doing now and what does the future look like?
Right. So I think this second coming of semiconductors, as India looks much better poised here. I think two or three big factors have contributed to it. The first is the cost of labor in other countries where this is being done has gone up. So India is now better from a cost perspective. Since the pandemic, supply chains have been disrupted. So there is a big need for diversifying your supply chain. That's number two. Number three is, and I would say this is the biggest one, there are two big powers now that are starting to look at each other as big powers. I think America is acknowledging China, and China is acknowledging America as two large powers, because Russia has declined. India, of course, is a rising power. But there is a clear sentiment which is wary or fearful of China. So there are these three things that have been uh, going, I would say, in India's favor. You have better quality and cost of labor. You need to be creating an alternative supply source, and you need to go out of China, right? So this China plus one is effectively working out to be India in a lot of situations. The government has also, in some ways, seized the opportunity. They've set up PLI schemes, policies that are helping India from a cost perspective for setting stuff up. I would say that the Silicon Cold War that is going on between US and China is what has resulted in Tata saying that they'll invest 90 billion um, in India, of which I would say 10 billion or more would probably be for semiconductors. Foxconn is setting up a massive plant, and for India to eventually recover this 30 to 40 billion dollar investment that is going to happen over the next 4 5 years, I think we'll have to be somewhere between 8 to 10% of the overall semiconductor market. Today we are practically zero. um, I think the movement is in the right direction. There's a lot of conversation that's happening, and obviously you need capex to start things off. I think we, at least when we wrote the story, we were pretty optimistic of India in the semiconductor landscape, and I think over the next 5 10 years we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, no, it sounds like geopolitical movements are moving finally in India's favor, and sounds like we have a bright future. Thank you so much, Abhiraj, for walking us through this piece, and thank you everyone for tuning in.